court were to establish such a specific standard under the Fourth Amendment about just dog technology, and it would have to be more focused with Congress. That's more in Congress's realm of influence to establish laws about certification. And I would like to establish that a sniff by a drug detection dog conducted at the front door of a private residence is not a search under the Fourth Amendment.
I have a question, though. Even if Congress passes such legislation, don't we still have the right to determine whether such legislation is consistent with the Fourth Amendment?
You do. The Supreme Court definitely does have that ability. It's the power of the Supreme Court. But if the Supreme Court, I think that would be more useful in retroactively changing laws made by Congress. I think that if we were to, or you were to go in and to say dogs must be certified every 2 years, that would start a bad precedent where Congress would have to step in and say thermal imaging software must be updated every year and police car radar must, I think that by being very specific about the level of technology that you're using, you're putting too much of a focus on just one very, very minuscule element.
Well, we don't need to be very specific, though. We can just say that they need to keep track of the field records. In this case, the records were extremely bad. They only kept track of the successes. I don't think it's a big thing or very specific to say that they also need to keep track of the failures.
If we only wrote down when A-Rod hit a home run, wouldn't we think that A-Rod hits home runs every single at bat? When in reality, a baseball player only hits the ball about 30% of the time.
Well, a baseball manager can keep track of whatever statistics they want to. Just as of right now, the states can keep track of whatever they want to. And in the state of Flamingo, they are choosing to just write down when A-Rod hits a home run. They aren't choosing to keep records, and there's no federal law saying that they have to do anything otherwise.
But should we create a law that requires a certain length or a certain amount of information that we need to assume that this dog is reliable?
No, the Supreme Court should not. An officer is more aware of its dog's successes than the Supreme Court is. It's not unagreeable right now for it to be left up to the states and then more specifically the individual police departments.
Do you think, though, if we don't make a decision now, do you think it's likely for Congress to pass such legislation? It seems to me, though, that they could just do whatever, just keep the same way it is, which is flawed.
Well, if it becomes a big enough problem where the legislators' constituents are raising enough of a fuss over the situation, then Congress would go in and step in if Congress found it necessary, and that would be more representative of what the public feels is unreasonable as opposed to what the Supreme Court...
I'd like to step away from the deciding if the dog is reliable and go on to the search of the house.
Yes, I'm fine with that.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it is not a search under the Fourth Amendment. While in Kylo it was established that using a thermal imager is a search under the Fourth Amendment, it is not allowed. This is very different than Kylo. You cannot compare a thermal imager to a drug dog sniff. A drug dog, like a drug sniffing dog, is a much more specific and focused type of search than a thermal imaging device. Thermal imaging device can reveal many private facts, such as when a woman is taking a bath or a man is going to a sauna. And a drug sniffing dog is only going to reveal the presence or absence of contraband. And a person under Cabela's, a person does not have a reasonable expectation of privacy with contraband.
Does that mean that we can walk down the street with a dog and have the dog sniff every single house on the block in hopes that we find contraband?
That is a possibility, but a police department most likely would not undertake that. That would require too much manpower. It would waste resources, waste the time of the officer and the dog. So, just like any other...
But they could, though.
They could, but a police officer could also... You could constantly have police officers patrolling specific streets under the current laws, and we don't see that on every single street. That if it's a place where it's necessary, yes, that might happen. But just because the technology exists and is allowed doesn't mean that the officers will constantly use it. It's a possibility, but the chances of it happening are remote because of what it would require.
Is it reasonable for a homeowner to expect that a dog will not enter their property? I guess I should rephrase it. Is it reasonable for me to assume that, for me to say that I don't think dogs should be coming up to my property, and I don't expect that to be a reasonable thing? Would you say a neighbor could walk up to your house without a dog?
Yes, a neighbor could approach.
Could they approach with a dog?
Yes.
What about a police officer without a dog? Could they approach your
Yes.
house but with a dog?
Yes.
But when your neighbor is approaching your house, they're not doing it with an intent to find contraband. When a police officer approaches your house with a drug-sniffing dog, there's only really one reason why that police officer would be at your house with that dog.
Yes.
I'm not arguing that a cop cannot go up to a door and do a talking chat or a greeting chat and find out some basic information. I'm wondering, is it reasonable for a police officer just to bring a drug-sniffing dog who only has one purpose up to a random house?
We do not believe that subjective intent factors into the equation, and we don't feel that you were discussing a knock and talk with an officer when just an officer approaches a home without a dog, and at that point the officer, without searching, if an officer were to knock on your door and you were to open your house and the door to your house, and he, with his plain sight, were to see marijuana plants growing inside, that would then give him the ability, that would be evidence that's not a search, and so it would be permissible evidence, and this is just plain sight, and we argue that the dog's plain smell is along the same lines. And
but this isn't plain smell, this is dog smell.
It is dog smell.
Plain touch and plain feel applies to humans.
But, how we feel is that a flashlight isn't plain sight, but this court has upheld the right of police officer to use a flashlight. It's not considered advanced enough technology like thermal imaging in Kylo, and so we are holding that using a dog's enhanced scent is akin to using a flashlight's enhanced light for increased sight.
Well, I think it's exactly almost on the same level as the thermal energy thing. A dog smell is 10,001. That's not a flashlight. It's basically a machine.
Well, another thing with technology is that, yes, it is much more extreme than the use of a flashlight. The only thing that a dog sniff will be revealing is the presence of contraband.
Do you know the case, by the way, for the flashlight?
The flashlight would have been referenced, not off the top of my head right now.
I was just going to look it up because I forget.
I know it's mentioned in the
It was in Kylo.
Okay, it was in Kylo. So
They talked about the flashlight.
Yeah.
Right.
But back to what I was saying, that in the key difference between, you can definitely argue that the power of a dog sniff is more like the power of a thermal imager, but the key differentiation we want to make is that a thermal imager can reveal private details about the house. It's not only going to reveal contraband, where a dog sniff will only be revealing contraband, and as I said earlier, under Cabela's, you have no reasonable expectation.
Well, just to clarify, there are multiple reasons why Kylo was ruled that way. One of them was that it revealed private information, but another one was that it revealed extrasensory information that wasn't available to a human. And I think that specific part, maybe not that part, but I think the other part certainly still applies to this dog case.
We would still argue that that using a dog sniff is more like the use of a flashlight or the use of eyeglasses. It's not the use of thermal imaging. It's a technology that has existed as long as dogs have. Going back into common law, dogs have been used to find Jack the Ripper. They were used in ancient Greece. So we would say that this isn't a special technology. It's not an evolving technology, which is something that you see with thermal imaging and similar things. A dog sniff will always be a dog sniff. It's not changing. And while it isn't necessarily a human sense, it is a God-given sense. I'm
less concerned, I guess, with the house specifically about the dog being reliable, and if it's if a sniff is a search. I'm more concerned about the trespassing on the property to perform the search, because I don't think it's reasonable for a citizen to just assume that police officers are going to come up to their house with a drug-sniffing dog.
Well, okay. The police officer Tram and Randy used the same walkway, the same thoroughfare that a Girl Scout would use, or a neighbor would use, or a police officer and a knock and talk would use.
What if there was a no trespassing sign or a no dogs allowed sign?
There's no trespassing sign or a no dogs allowed sign. That would change the scenario.
Why wouldn't all drug dealers just put up a no trespassing and no dogs allowed sign, and that could pretty much get them away from ever having to deal with a sniff?
Well, this isn't. Do those signs have like legal bearing? They do. Yes. A drug dealer would not just put up that sign.
It's a question I think you're gonna have to think about.
Yeah.
That's a question from the actual
Yeah.
arguments.
That's a good question, but and yeah, that is definitely something that we will have to consider going forward in
Here's a
this.
question. Do they look into why you want to be like no trespassing to get that certification? Like if you say no trespassing, do they ask you like?